welcome to American Pulse. We continue our journey with Meet the Pharaohs, Egyptian tourism, and today is a very special episode with Dr. Nicholas Rieves. He's the man of the hour. He's the man of the century, as we say. He's working great discoveries in Egypt, and we've been trying to get an interview with him for a few months now, but thank God it's finally in. Welcome to the show, Dr. Rieves.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for everything you do for Egypt and the Egyptians and the pharaohs.
Well, thank you. This is it's a pleasure all round.
All right, so Dr. Rieves, before we get into what you're doing now in Egypt and the great discoveries you're about to accomplish, tell me about yourself a little bit. Like, how did you get into the Egyptology world and why Egypt is a concern for you?
Well, I guess my inspiration to get into Egyptology was the tomb of Tutankhamun itself. The tomb of Tutankhamun has been the common single thread through my childhood and professional career, and I just find it endlessly fascinating as a burial.
How did you learn about the Egyptian history, like since you were a child? Where were you born and raised, and how did you get it?
Okay, I was born in the north of England, just outside Manchester, and I worked as a volunteer at my local museum that happened to have a small Egyptian collection, and they allowed me to study that. So by the time I was 13, 14, I was actually handling ancient Egyptian pieces, and as a kid you're like a sponge, so you really absorb stuff. And so I really absorbed a feeling and a passion for ancient Egypt because of that early exposure. And then I went to university. I went to University College London to do my first degree, and then I did my PhD at Durham University in the north of England.
So it's been all a passion about the ancient Egyptian history.
Yeah, passion for ancient Egypt, and Egypt itself has been a passion all my life. Yes.
Before we started recording, we talked about you visiting Egypt, and you told me that you go quite often to Egypt now.
Yes, at the moment I'm going very frequently, and every month or 2 months or so, as we pursue our investigations in the tomb, and I try and finish off some work that I've started several years ago and is now trying to get published.
Dr. Rieves, now we're about, hopefully to discover the greatest discovery in Egypt about the tomb of Nefertiti. It was your theory, your idea. Can you tell us how this came about?
Well, I would emphasize from the very beginning that this is, at this stage, just a hypothesis.
So you're saying that it's only a hypothesis now, but what are you basing your hypothesis on?
Well, it's ironic that we're doing this interview in the exhibition of Tutankhamun replicas in New York, because it was the production of a facsimile of the tomb of Tutankhamun by a Madrid-based company called Factum Arte that led to this idea in the first place. Factum Arte were producing for the Egyptian government a facsimile of the tomb of Tutankhamun for tourist use, and they were not content to just take a few photographs and paste them on boards and present that as the burial chamber. They actually did surface scans of the walls of the painted burial chamber in Tutankhamun's tomb, and posted this data online in the beginning of 2014. And thanks to this data, we can now look at the tomb of Tutankhamun. We can now look at the burial chamber of Tutankhamun behind the paintings. We can digitally remove the painted surfaces, and we can see the physicality of the walls, every surface, all the surface texture and the bumps and lumps and lines. And this new information, when I first started looking at it, I couldn't believe my eyes, because I could see traces of what looked like doorways. And I spent the next year analyzing this data and going over and over, trying to prove to myself actually that these couldn't be doorways. But because it was such a ridiculous idea that the tomb of Tutankhamun might be bigger than we've always suspected, yeah. But the more work I did, the more evidence I discovered in support of this hypothesis. And I think I've been able now to put together a rational argument to explain these traces and what they might perhaps mean.
Is there any way you can further in details tell us what is the rationale?
Well,
or this is like secret,
nothing is secret. I started to take these traces seriously when I did some measurements of the apparent doorway in the west wall, and I found that the measurements, the size proportions of the doorway I could see hidden behind the west wall painting of the burial chamber, when I found that these dimensions were precisely the same as the dimensions of the entrance into the annex of Tutankhamun's tomb. This was beyond coincidence, and actually an extra chamber at the point where this suggested doorway seemed to be made a lot of sense in understanding the plan of the tomb of Tutankhamun, because a regular Egyptian royal king's tomb the burial chamber is surrounded by 4 storage chambers. Now, because of the way that Tutankhamun's tomb was orientated, there was only room for 3 chambers, but this was potentially the missing 3rd chamber. So that's when I started to take things seriously, and I looked at the traces on the north wall and found that the traces there also could be also tied in very closely with other features of the tomb of Tutankhamun. For example, there's one line on the north wall running from floor to ceiling, which is very, very clear, and it looks like the edge of a corner of something. And this lines up precisely with the width of the antechamber. So it gives the impression that what the antechamber and burial chamber started off life as was one long corridor, and that this corridor actually continues behind and beyond the north wall. Now we've done thermal imaging has been done of the tomb, and radar tests have been made. The Minister of Antiquities announced this in November, and these initial radar tests showed pretty clearly that it looked like there is a void, something going on behind both the west wall, where I think there's this putative Tutankhamun storeroom, and behind the north wall, which I believe leads to something far more interesting.
So do you think that this tomb was originally made for Queen Nefertiti, and because of the accidental death of King Tut, they were like panicking, where are we going to bury him, we have this? Is that what you're trying to say?
I certainly think that the tomb of Tutankhamun is a tomb within a tomb. That Tutankhamun died unexpectedly. Everybody panicked. The successor king needed to provide his predecessor with a formal Egyptian burial. Where would he do this? There was 70 days to do this, the mummification period. Yeah. So I think what they did was they opened a tomb that was already there, the tomb of an Egyptian queen, because the right turning ground plan that I think we can now discern in Tutankhamun's tomb, they suggest that it was the tomb of a queen. They opened this tomb, and simply adapted the outer parts of this queen's tomb for the burial of Tutankhamun himself, and that the original owner is still buried beyond the north wall in a single chamber.
Of course, God willing, if this is what's happening there, this is going to be a great discovery. But the question is, and let me play the devil advocate, if you don't mind. Howard Carter was there. How come he couldn't find us?
Well, not only Carter was oblivious to this possibility, but everybody, because until this new technology, where the new technology allowed us to see the physicality of the wall. At the moment you look at the paintings and you see nothing but the paintings, you can't see the actual surface. Digitally now we can see the surface without the paintings. So we see the walls in their complete physicality. We can see the plasterer's marks. We can see these lines. We can see these doorways. And Carter wasn't able to see any of this.
So you're trying to tell me through technology you're able to see all of that without damaging the walls?
Yes, there's no damage has been done, nor will be done. As an Egyptologist, I've dedicated my life to preserving ancient Egypt, and certainly no one would countenance any damage to the tomb of Tutankhamun at all.
You had mentioned something about the colors of the walls and how they have changed to adapt or accommodate the new burial of King Tut. So if you can elaborate more on this.
Sure. The Getty Conservation Institute has been working in the tomb burial chamber of Tutankhamun for a long time, and they've analysed the paintings that are there. And the north wall painting, which I suggest conceals access to another burial beyond the original burial in that tomb, they have discovered that north wall was originally painted on a white background, and that the current yellow background that we see now was only added at the time of Tutankhamun in order to turn that room into a burial chamber for Tutankhamun. Now what's interesting is, if that is the painting that was originally put there to conceal the continuation of the burial beyond the north wall, then the physical features of those of the figures shown in those paintings should tell us who the person is that's buried beyond. Now, if we look at the two main features, the scene where at the moment it's labelled as King I opening the mouth of the Pharaoh Tutankhamun. Excuse me. If we look at that critically, we see that the figure that's currently labelled as the mummy of Tutankhamun has a distinct line at the corner of its mouth, and this is interesting because it's a characteristic of images of Nefertiti, who I believe ruled eventually as Smenkhare. It's a characteristic feature of Nefertiti, which you even find on the bust in Berlin. Beneath CAT scans were taken of the bust, which showed the original surface of the bust, the first version of the bust, and it had the same kind of wrinkles. Potentially, that line identifies this figure as an image not of Tutankhamun as it's now labelled, but as of Nefertiti herself. If we look at the image of the king currently labelled as I opening the mouth of this mummy, we don't see the face of I at all. We see the face of a king with a little rounded chin here, and which is identical to images of the infant Tutankhamun, this little double chin. It's a characteristic feature of an Amana child. And so my suggestion is that whilst we've got an image at the moment that's labelled as in the hieroglyphs as eye opening the mouth of Tutankhamun, originally that was prepared as an image of Tutankhamun, who was the successor to Nefertiti Smenkhare, opening the mouth of Nefertiti Smenkhare.
Now the $1 million question is, how is the government of Egypt cooperating to your discovery, like when you reached out, and have you found any difficulties or things were going fine?
My experience with the government of Egypt has been wonderful. The Minister of Antiquities obviously heard about this theory. He contacted me to ask for more information. I went to Egypt. I was invited to Egypt to present my findings to a commission of Egyptian Egyptologists. They listened patiently while I explained. We went down to the tomb of Tutankhamun. We looked at the tomb itself, and I went through all the various points of my theory. The minister himself, Dr. Al-Damati, added to the theory by pointing out something I'd missed, which is I believe in the north wall we have on the left-hand side we have solid bedrock. On the right-hand side we have a partition wall which conceals a corridor, and within that partition wall I believe there's a smaller service doorway. The minister pointed out that there is in fact a very clear difference between the partition wall plastering and the plastering in the position of this smaller entrance doorway.
The entrance doorway.
Yeah. And it's very, very clear. The smaller doorway is plastered with a much grittier type of material, and then we compared that finish with the finish of the blockings that Carter had to remove to get into the tomb, the blocked doorways, because they'd been plastered as well. And the plaster of the blockings is identical to the plaster in this point of the north wall, suggesting that this is indeed another blocking. So we've been working very closely together. I mean, the Ministry of Antiquities has been extremely supportive of my work. Everybody's interested. You know, we're all scholars. We're all interested in getting to the truth of the matter. And if we don't investigate this, we'll never know. We'll always have that niggling thing at the back of our mind. Exactly. And our investigations cause no damage to the tomb. As I've already explained, this is the last thing anybody...
You explained in the investigation, but for further investigation, if you would need to drill in the wall, can you explain to the viewers how you planning to go about this without damaging the actual tomb of Kinta?
Well, nobody wants to damage the paintings. Those paintings are amongst the greatest treasures of ancient Egypt. So, nobody wants to drill a hole through those. But if one was to investigate from the adjacent treasury, which is undecorated, then one could investigate from that room. Yeah.
And you're telling me that basically the risk is zero?
I think the risk is zero, yeah. Nobody would take risks with this. This is the tomb of Tutankhamun. Nobody would take risks.
So I think there's no reason not to further investigate and find out more what's hiding behind this wall, even if there was nothing like you mentioned, we're not losing anything.
If the theory is wrong, the theory is wrong. If the theory is right, oh my God, yes. So I think with odds like that, it makes sense to investigate.
Some of the archaeologists, and some of them are very dear friends of mine, and they mentioned that there's no way Nefertiti would be buried in the same area where King Tut, based on the history of the families and things like that. What do you say?
There's a lot we don't understand about the Amarna period, but my interpretation of what happens at the end of the Amarna period is that it wasn't Tutankhamun who started to make renew links with Thebes and the Amun priesthood. This was actually started by Akhenaten's co-regent Nefertiti, who I believe was Nefertiti. If that's the case, then Nefertiti actually mentions in an inscription in a graffito found at Thebes that she has a mortuary temple at Thebes. So things have already started moving back at the time Nefertiti was alive. We know that a lot of the material that Tutankhamun was actually buried with had originally been prepared for Nefertiti as co-regent Nefertiti. And we can see that the style and the iconography and everything of this material is of the old-fashioned Assyrian religion. Akhenaten's worship of the Aten, I think, was a very personal thing. Of course, Nefertiti was carried along with it because she was his great royal wife. But by the time she was in a position to make decisions herself, I think she was trying to mend fences, and she was actually preparing to have herself buried as in the traditional Assyrian fashion.
I've heard you telling people that were in your tour and exhibit here in New York City you're encouraging them to go and visit Egypt and see the real thing. And the question that gets, to a lot of people's mind, if there's such a beautiful exhibit out here in New York City, why tourists need to have the urge to go to see Egypt?
The great thing about exhibitions outside Egypt is that these exhibitions act as ambassadors for Egypt. They whet people's appetite. People come here and they see these replicas and they realize, and it opens their eyes to the potential of ancient Egypt and the real things that they would be able to see if they visit. And I encourage people to go. It's a wonderful time to go. It's, who'd want to be in New York in this weather when they could be in Egypt?
And also, I remember one of the questions a very interesting question, one of the ladies, she was worried about the security of these ancient Egyptian pieces. And it struck me that sometimes they think that what's happening in Egypt, that what happened in Iraq, and where all the civilization have been destroyed. And thank you that you were able to clarify to them that Egypt is very stable. So, what do you think of the Egyptian situation now after two revolutions, and how the country is, whether you see it stable or not?
Well, all my experience tells me it's very stable, and Egypt's gone through difficult times, and it's pulling itself out of those difficult times and stabilizing. And I want people to help. I want people to encourage people to visit Egypt and to let's get things back to normal.
I couldn't help but notice in the replicas here, they're well maintained, well cleaned, well preserved, and well put to show in a nice way. And I hated to feel that sometimes when I go to Egypt and visit some of the temples and some of the museums, things are not on the same standard. So what's your take on that?
Well, not every museum in the West is is a great museum, is a metropolitan museum of art. Some museums have more money than others. I understand, and I think a lot of people understand that money is scarce in Egypt, and I try to encourage people to go to Egypt because the more they go, that is what is going to help. The money that they put into the Egyptian economy will be used to the more tourists, the better museums. But museums are. The Cairo Museum is one of the greatest museums in the world. The Grand Egyptian Museum will be stupendous when it's finished. I
think it will be the capital of the museums in the world.
Absolutely, and rightly so. So, there have been easier times, I'm sure, but I'm optimistic for the future, and I really, I really hope things, continue to get better, and I'm doing my bit.
That would be great. Tell us, what are your next steps and the time frame for your steps to hopefully find the tomb of Queen Nefertiti?
Well, I mean, I'm not calling the shots on this at all. This is the Ministry of Antiquities that's leading this, and the Egyptian government itself. I'm giving what advice and help I can. I'm trying to find funding to move this project forward. I'm encouraging people to continue with this, and everything.
Like, in other words, what I meant is, what are the normal steps that would be taken once the government of Egypt gives you the green light to proceed?
Well, we need to investigate whether we've done thermal imaging. We've tested with radar. It looks as if there might be something there.
How does it look in the radar? Like different temperature levels, or?
That's what thermal imaging shows you, different temperature levels. Radar will reveal whether there's a void, and reading radar is, I'm told, I'm not a radar specialist, but I'm told it's a bit of a black art. It's not being able to read in detail radar.
Not like an MRI.
No, it's not. You don't actually get an image of what's there. But my radar specialist is pretty optimistic about the future.
Do you think one of the suggestions were to have another different type of radar to compare the readings to the first reading you had?
Well, I'm all in favor of any tests. Yeah, why not? Why not?
It only helps to further investigate, right?
Yeah. The clearer a picture we've got, the better. So, I'm not against further tests at all.
All right. So, Dr. Reeves, thank you very, very much for your insights and for all the great work you're doing. And I don't think that work is only for Egypt; it's for the humanity in general. Like, to find out where the tomb of Queen Nefertiti. This is big. This is huge. Good luck.
Thank you very much indeed. We're heading in the right direction, I think. Thank you.
Hopefully, after the discovery, we'll have another interview and we'll congratulate you for the discovery.
Thank you so much.
This is a particularly interesting one, the North Wall, especially this end of it. What we see in the surface scans is around the line of this staff held by the king, we see a vertical, a strict vertical here, which finishes at the top with a strange diagonal crack, which is consistent with this being an edge of a corner, and with this being solid bedrock, as in fact this demonstrates, this niche that was cut into the wall at this stage, it's obviously cut into solid rock, partition wall, which the crack at the top suggests has slumped slightly and pulled away. This is a very characteristic, this crack at the top is very characteristic of the sort of the effect that one gets when a partition wall moves. Now within this, so this would be the edge, and the partition would run the full length of this wall, and the tomb would continue at the same width as the antechamber into the Jebel, to another burial chamber, the burial chamber of who I believe was the original owner of the tomb, a queen who became pharaoh, in other words, Nefertiti. Now within this wall, there are other features. There's a line somewhere around here, and in the surface scan, which seems to define an interior doorway at this point, which, and you might ask, well, why would you have a solid partition here and then with a surface, with a small doorway within it? Well, in fact, if what we see is what actually exists, there is the division between the antechamber and the burial chamber. Howard Carter found exactly the same situation: a partition wall with a smaller doorway within. And the reason there was a smaller doorway within this partition was, once it introduced the shrines into Tutankhamun's burial chamber, they built the partition wall, but they left an inner doorway to actually come and go to continue the stocking, to complete the stocking of the tomb. And originally there would have been on this smaller partition door, I suspect, a wooden door that could have been sealed at the end of each working day. So we have this type of doorway here, I suggest, and mimicking the one that was on the other side of the shrine.